It's my pleasure to introduce you to the two guests who will be featured today, Rajs Dhanda and Seema Modi. Rajs Dhanda is the Chief Executive Officer of Black Creek Group. You guys can make your way up here. You can come on up as they make their way up here. Raj is responsible for the oversight of distribution, marketing, product development, operations, legal functions, basically everything. Prior to joining Black Creek Group, Mr. Dhanda spent 26 years at Morgan Stanley. You can read much more in the bios that are in your program. And you're about to hear Raj reflect on his journey to the top of the corporate ladder. He's going to share some of his insights that he acquired along the way. And guiding this conversation today is Seema Modi. She's a global markets reporter for CNBC. And she focuses on the intersection of foreign policy and on Wall Street. And she also hosts several digital shows, covers the travel industry. You can read more about her in the program as well. So sit back, relax, imagine a fireplace, and help me give a warm welcome to Raj and Seema.
Thank you so much. All right, Raj, pleasure to sit down with you today. And thank you for joining us.
Great to be here.
So let's start from the beginning. Prior to Black Creek, you were at Morgan Stanley, and even before that, you graduated at Brown University. You majored in management and economics. Born here or outside? Born here. What city?
White Plains.
So how did you go from White Plains to Brown to here you are, as CEO of Black Creek?
Well, I don't know how much time anybody has. That's open-ended but appropriate. One of the things that throughout the journey, and I think when you're on it, you don't think as much about it, or at least you shouldn't. I tried not to. But like a lot of younger people and millennials, I kind of had 2 and 3 year blocks of my life that seemed to really fall together. I was just saying my dad went to an IIT school, one of the engineering schools in India, and was his first job, the reason we moved after I was born in White Plains, he was at Columbia, UMass, so now I'm going to give you the early days. He was a graduate student at Columbia. My mom was here on an Indian dance scholarship. They met at one of her recitals. We ended up moving to Boston because he was asked by Stop and Shop to do marketing research, which back then was a fancy description for picking their store sites. So my dad moved us to Boston. He started in real estate. I started in diapers. Our generation didn't really think through a lot of the decisions. We just did them with a little more pace and less thought. And I had a really outstanding experience at Morgan Stanley. It's, as you've heard from speakers and as you know, and as it's similar to some of the other companies that are in New York, it has scale and it has brand and it offered me, as I moved from investment banking originally through trading, wealth management, capital markets, a host of different roles. It really grounded me in some degree of modesty, but some degree of being a bit fearless and moving around with the benefit of some great mentors throughout the time.
Yeah, that's very interesting and important context as we try to dive into a discussion around diversity and inclusion. I'm really curious, how do you think your prioritization of diversity changed or evolved from going from a big financial firm like Morgan Stanley to now a real estate investment firm, Black Creek?
Yeah, so it's a good question. Diversity of thought has always been something that at Black Creek, the founders and I have made a priority of. And I think what's fascinating and important, as I was talking earlier to a lot of people here and to me, is in my 30 years since I've been out of college, I've really only had 2 jobs, but relatively late in my career, I had to reinvent myself. And so I borrowed a bit from Morgan Stanley on diversity. And large firms are great at tracking the data and talking about the impact that diversity could and should have. And I learned early, John Mack was the CEO I worked for a long time, and he always said the company's best assets go up and down in the elevator, and that meant a lot. And so thinking about banks is not about a place people put money, but talent was ingrained early. Diversity, though, it's hard to, diversity of thought and then people, it's hard to make change at a firm like a Morgan Stanley or some of the ones. And I don't want to suggest that those firms aren't making changes, but what's been really exciting at Black Creek, where we have 300 employees, but we've hired 100 in the last year, and where our company has grown from managing 5 or 6 billion in assets to 11 or 12, we can make changes much more easily. So our ability to execute on diversity has been really exciting, and it starts, as I said, with diversity of thought, and it starts also, I think, at the entry levels and the most junior levels. So we've adopted some of the internship programs and some of the things that were in place at Morgan Stanley. We brought them to Denver.
Sure. I interview CEOs on CNBC, and diversity often comes up in the discussion about how to make it a priority, a commitment that not only runs through the C-suite, but the entire organization. When you're trying to recruit individuals, and retain the right people, what's the strategy that you use while also keeping diversity a priority?
We spend a tremendous amount of time making it a very personal experience, and one of the things I learned, and it's a bit of an evolution. When I first started on Wall Street, I thought I had a job, and then it started to feel a bit cultish at one point, which you start to believe that these jobs are more than they're meant to be. And I've actually come on the other side of that now, where when we recruit people, we try to really understand what's important to their family, who is their family, is the job going to fit their family? And I think if you do that well, you're actually able to retain your talent and motivate it over the longer term a lot more effectively. It's particularly important at firms that no one's heard of, like where I work today. When you work at Morgan Stanley, it's pretty easy to recruit people. They just know the firm and they think it's a super branded place to be. When you're at a firm that's lesser known, you need to really convince people that they're working there for you, and they need to understand that you care about them in a very different way, and it's something we spend a lot of time on.
When we have this conversation around diversity, there is this one pervasive belief, not justified, but it does come up of, can diversity and excellence conflict at times? And I'm curious if you've seen that take place, whether it's at where you work at now, or just in the broader financial industry, making it a priority, but also holding on to the values and keeping success in mind. How do you make those two coincide?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think diversity for diversity's sake is not, it's not helpful to anyone. I think diversity to empower, improve, and enhance an organization is how you have to go about it. We have some of the most talented, diverse people that we've promoted and recruited at Black Creek, and in all those cases, we spent a lot of time making sure they stood on the merits, and then thought about what were the ways to make sure they were successful. I often think getting into a position is only half the battle. You need to set someone up to be successful. And so we spend a lot of time making sure that any of the diverse population really are supported once they're in elevated and senior roles. And as I said, it's been fascinating but exciting to be at a growing new, emerging company, and with so fewer decision makers required, you can affect change, and then you almost have to be careful that all the change you're affecting is supported and institutionalized.
Certainly exciting and informative time, perhaps, to build a company this fast and keep all those goals in mind.
Correct.
We talked about some of the opportunities. What are some of the challenges that you've encountered in trying to advance some of these goals around diversity and inclusion, and how you kind of overcame those hurdles?
Well, I mean, commercial real estate is even further behind financial services in terms of a diverse population. So
why do you think that is?
I'm not sure why. I think there is in real estate, there's a perspective that even more so than in public markets, even more so than in other more mature markets, that transactions happen based on relationships, and it's one of the ultimate. It's one of the least disrupted markets in terms of transparency and technology. So today, most of our real estate happens off market, based on relationships that people have, and those industries tend to be ones that are the slowest to adopt to a really diverse population. So I think you have to continuously remind people that diversity of thought is what's going to make us better, and it actually is something you can't take for granted. There is a perspective when we said that at least half our internship program would need to be from a diverse population. There was a perspective that seems way overdone, or in some of the new ventures that we pursued, we looked for people that weren't in some of the most obvious areas with the same goal in mind. So it's hard because, like other industries, everybody knows someone, and it's pretty likely that they don't know someone of a diverse background.
Is there an opportunity in real estate to not only project or share those goals with other real estate professionals, but also maybe some of the clients, those who are leasing warehouses or other assets that you have in your portfolio?
There is, and you made me think of. You interview CEOs on CNBC often, and in real estate, I was just trying to think of if any of the public company CEOs. If there's any diverse leadership, and I'm not sure there is actually, as I sort of think
in real
about
estate.
the list. So I think it is behind, but there is no question that as real estate's democratized, one of the things that Black Creek does is offer a lot of solutions that are institutional but are accessible by individuals, and so we need to be much as an industry, provide a much greater reach. In a lot of the emerging markets around the world, real estate's a much more significant allocation to everybody's wealth. The U.S. is actually the other way.
Yeah, I was going to ask if, although, if you look at foreign direct inflows, they've come down from China, but in general, would China be, in the past, being a bigger buyer of real estate, has that at all had an impact on the diversity that we're seeing in the C-suite amongst those in the real estate industry? But I guess there's still room for opportunity and improvement.
Yes, I think there's a lot.
Time for some advice for those in the audience here, Raj, minority groups or other Asian Americans looking to break the glass ceiling in their respective industry. What advice or thoughts would you like to convey?
I mentioned two earlier. When I worked at Morgan Stanley, I found that there were, everyone who can get a job there has some degree of excellence already, and the level of arrogance or lack of modesty really tripped up people more often than you can imagine. And it sounds simple or even glib, but honestly, the degree of modesty saved or enhanced, or I thought, in my case, I never took I think you need to realize there aren't people, certainly what I did at Morgan Stanley, saving anyone's life or really improving their communities and impacting it, and that's a very non-investment banker perspective. So modesty was a really important, it was often important for me to be reminded that, there are so many people that lose sight of that, and it was an important skill that...
Can we explore that a little bit more? What exactly do you mean by that? It's a great reminder, but is there a use case or an example of when it can really play a pivotal role?
Yeah, so I was there during some, the emerging markets crisis had a big impact on my early days there. The tech crisis the tech bubble was, changed our firm a lot in the business than the global financial crisis. And each of the times there was a tremendous amount of stress, I think, on the systems and the platforms and the people. And at financial services firms and investment banks, there's always a lot of people running around trying to sell themselves internally and get credit for what they're doing. And if you watched who would, it became so clear that if you were able to keep your head down, and as I said, sounds pretty cliched, but if you could stay out of the business of selling yourself internally, you would actually find yourself in a position where people would come and recognize and want to reward you. The flip side of that is I've also met so many people during their careers that were afraid of new opportunities. And so you need a degree of confidence or let me just give this a try, and sort of an optimistic glass half full perspective. This might actually work out. And my family moved to Denver recently, as you know, and I took on a new role at a new company in a new city, and so many things were different. And whether it was that decision or other times at Morgan Stanley when I moved from different roles, I don't ever know that I had perfect information as to what the other side would look like. And there were a lot of people that considered different roles, tried to get perfect information. By the time they got half of half the information they needed, the opportunity came and went. So I think it's sort of a balance between some degree of modesty, which I say it understanding that that's not normal for investment bankers to have, but they should have more of it, and then a degree of fearlessness in terms of trying different things.
Same for broadcasters. So no, I'm kidding. But it is this elegant dance of modesty but confidence, right, that you have to straddle through for many industries. I'd like to open up this session to any questions that you may have for Raj. Yes, please, stand up and please introduce yourself. There will be a mic right behind you.
Great, thank you. Henry Young with HHN Capital. Raj, you talked about real estate being one of the field that hasn't really moved with the time, right? I think it's just as a result of how the industry works. I think two parts to the question. First part is, I've seen a lot more sort of platform companies sort of try to democratize, whether it's commercial or residential real estate. How much have you seen they have progressed in terms of democratizing it? That's the first question. Second question is a little bit shorter. Wall Street, in terms of investment management, ESG has been the theme. You can pick ESG companies to invest. How do you do that in real estate? Thank you.
Sure, great questions. So by democratization of real estate, the way I think about it is the investment solutions today are more transparent, they're aligned. Said differently, the industry and our firm in particular offers to individuals institutionally priced product. And that hasn't been the case for a long time. 25 years ago, public REITs were supposed to be the way to get exposure to institutional quality real estate. But today you have tremendous correlations with the rest of the public equity markets, so they don't really provide uncorrelated income, which there's now solutions that offer that. So it is really important that's done right. If you look at individuals today, and remember there's two types of real estate you live in and real estate you live off of. And so many people think the real estate they're living in represents their allocation to commercial real estate. So you need to actually baseline the conversation there. But in most portfolios today, individuals have 60% in equities, 40% in bonds. And of course it's evolving in the last 8-10 years that there's an allocation to alternatives or private markets. But today, not for people of the sophistication in this room, but if you look around the country, individuals have $12, $15 trillion invested across their financial advisor relationships, and less than 1% is allocated to commercial real estate. Whereas the largest sovereign wealth funds that see the most have upwards of 18, 20%. So we've spent a lot of time, as have the biggest institutions. Blackstone recently has come out and said half of the capital that they raise 5 years from now will be from individuals. This is an institutional firm through and through, and 10 years ago they didn't have any. So the democratization of real estate is real because it offers income, which flows directly from rent. And with all the complexity of other debt products, that waterfall is pretty simple, right? The properties earn rent and they get passed on through the REIT structures. And by the way, it's tax efficient, and globally all the rates are low. Anyway, I can tell from SEMA I should move on to the second part. ESG is so a lot of our real estate is industrial assets, warehouses that benefit from all the activity that logistics has borne. And so like other commercial real estate firms, we're just beginning to think about how to be, how to have an ESG policy that really impacts the environment. But as both a developer and an owner, we have an opportunity to do that. I just don't think we've really dug in on it in a meaningful way. There are a lot of opportunities because of our footprint. It's in industrial assets getting closer and closer to communities. So if you want your Amazon product to be delivered in 2 hours, our warehouse needs to be much closer to urban communities. So there's a lot of work going into it, but it's early days for sure.
It's fascinating. Yes.
Hi, Raj. Hi, Seema. My name is Priya Rajani, and I work at Citi in corporate client strategy. My question is related to your journey. You mentioned that when you started working, very typical Asians, and I'm sorry to stereotype all of us, is that we just took the next job that came to us, didn't think too much about, and we paced ourselves, and there was more concerns about job stability than getting the next job. And then you talked about that, very recently you kind of redefined yourself, and I apologize for misquoting you, but something may have triggered what you did differently, that you are now at Black Creek, you're the CEO. And I don't know if this is something you imagined, you had a plan for this. How did that happen? What was that trigger point, or how did you get yourself to get out of that well-paced journey to where you are today?
It's a great question. I can reflect on it. I will not pretend like I prepared for the moment. I mean, the biggest irony after 25 or 26 years of advising companies or individuals, I didn't have plan B set up. I knew I didn't want to go to a slightly lesser bank and take a slightly lesser job when I left Morgan Stanley. I wanted something new, different, and challenging. And I looked at a lot of different opportunities. I think you're right. Early on in your career, you kind of just, and Asians are notorious, are consistently cited for just taking the next job without a lot of, not a lot of noise or complaining. Just do what you're told. Although, I had to take, I really took a big risk, and I was willing to because I felt like this was for the first time a big family decision and less about me and my career. And the biggest part of my wanting to work, I'd worked 25, 26 years in investment banking. You're supposed to be done by then. And I was 48 and I didn't want to be done. I knew that. But for the first time it was, look, you may not get paid the same way. You may not work the same way. But it felt very, it felt like the founders were really going to take a big risk on me. And that was the alignment that I was really happy about. But I think the most important thing is you can't be afraid of failing. And for a long time, the Morgan Stanley job was, move from this box over to, go from this department to this department. At the time, it was a big deal. It really wasn't. This was a case where I really believed in some of the opportunities in private markets versus public markets. I really believed in the migration for talent out of New York and San Francisco into Colorado. And so that I thought we could recruit other people to do the same. And I really believed that if it was a chance to be in a growth, being on Wall Street post-global financial crisis, you were often measured on how fast you could shrink costs, not grow revenues. And nothing about Black Creek is about, it's the reverse.
It's a great question. Just to follow up, I'm sure there there were a number of industries you could have worked in given your experience at Morgan Stanley. Perhaps this is redundant. You touched on the big opportunity in industrial and warehouses, but why did you decide to go into real estate? Was it the front row seat you would have into this explosive boom we've seen in e-commerce? Was it Denver? What was it?
It was a little bit of everything. I mentioned my father went into real estate when we first moved to Boston. He ended up for 15, 20 years helping Stop and Shop pick their store sites in New England. And I had my career at Morgan Stanley, which he was wholly unimpressed with. He was wondering when I was going to get a real job. And interestingly, I was paid in stock, and stock prices go up and down, and I always sold at the highs sold at the lows and bought at the highs. He was not impressed with that either. And, he just kept assembling real estate without paying, with tax-efficient investments. So there's, a great ability to humbly grow a portfolio during a long period of time. And so when all of a sudden he quietly became the if there was a race, he was the winner and I was not. And I realized this was a great asset class. But it also has to do with, interestingly enough, right before I joined Black Creek, Blackstone launched their retail strategies. And we did know that the asset class was going to be institutionalized. And I did feel like Black Creek would benefit from, I knew I could add value right away because of both the wealth management and investment banking experience.
Very interesting. Is there another question? Yes, in the front.
Raj, thank you so much for your expertise. My name is Jean Lown with JP Morgan. I think it would be a missed opportunity, Seema, if we didn't ask you, given that you have lots of exposures to CEO, as well as have a lot of insights from all of the interviews that you do, to ask you a little bit about some of your either tips or feedback around what we're discussing at this conference today, which is the now generation and our impact on diversity and inclusion going forward.
Sure. I think similar to what Raj said, but from my personal experience as a journalist, when I first went knocking on the door at CNBC in New York, they said you have no experience. So the way I was able to get an opportunity was I worked in India first with CNBC TV 18 as an Indian American, and then got experience in that foreign bureau, and then finally, persistence paid off, and then I got an opportunity here in New York. So in a way, I feel like using my Indian heritage, diversity as an asset, and something that could help me thrive in that international bureau is sort of what I tried to do, and I think it absolutely worked in my benefit in a way that it helped set me apart from perhaps some of the other applicants and others who were also trying to get a role at CNBC. Yeah. Last question, anyone? Yes.
My name's Nancy Joyce. I'm with PDT Global. You mentioned modesty as something to hold on to as you go through your career. And I do a lot of work in diversity and inclusion. And one of my observations that's actually backed up by research is that a lot of Asian cultures really value modesty, actually. And the problem for a lot of professionals in the workplace that are of Asian descent, and particularly female, is not modesty. It's they have that in spades. It's actually how do you get recognized and how do you self-promote in a way that doesn't come across as obnoxious. And so I'm wondering, what strategies you would suggest to them in order to promote their careers.
Yeah, that's totally fair. And the context with which I say modesty is the other Asians that I worked with at Morgan Stanley were, everybody walked in the door with a real background and a real set of excellence. So the cohort as a whole lacked a lot of modesty. So I agree with you that often, and I'm sure all the analysis you mentioned is spot on. I think today the best way is to create value for your boss and your company. I mean, we're at basically full employment. So if you're not getting rewarded and recognized now I think a lot of people are interested in supporting diverse talent. And, I think today it goes back to creating value for your company and giving people the opportunity to understand what you can do well. But it's a great time to make gains and affect change, because talent's at a real premium right now, and it hasn't felt this good in a long time, I think, in that respect. So I think a lot of it just comes down to executing and providing value, and there's a real need for diversity of thought. And so I think people understand that. They're a little hesitant to actually drive diversity top down. We just just for the sake of diversity. But anyway, that's my perspective on it today.
Well, thank you for providing your perspective. It's been a great conversation, Raj. Thank you for your time. Raj Dhanda.
Thank you.